And our mission today is to try and understand Europe's current predicament. We're going to meticulously explore how various instruments, various pressures have not only impacted its prosperity, but I think more importantly, examine the historical trajectory of this relationship with the United States.
Yeah.
We'll try to unravel why Europe's dependency on the U.S. has, well, seemingly deepened, rather than paving the way for it to become a stronger, more independent competitor. It's a story of evolving dynamics, sometimes subtle, sometimes overtly confrontational, that has profoundly shaped the continent.
We're going to start by looking at the immediate tensions, the compromises Europe has faced very recently. Then we'll delve into the powerful economic and military tools that have strategically shaped its trajectory.
Key tools, absolutely.
From there, we'll trace the historical roots of this dependency, understanding how it became so ingrained, particularly in the post-war era. And finally, we'll weigh the critical choices Europe now faces. This isn't just, abstract geopolitics. It's about the very fabric of international power and the complex choices facing a continent really at a crossroads.
The immediate situation then. When we analyze Europe's recent diplomatic actions, there's a pretty consistent pattern of concessions emerging.
You see it time and again.
Exactly. We're seeing repeated instances where Europe has backed down to the United States, particularly when it comes to getting a seat at crucial negotiation tables. Specifically, we're talking about the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict. Europe seems to have made repeated compromises in order to get a seat at the Russia-Ukraine negotiation table.
That specific goal, yes.
And this isn't an isolated incident, is it? It feels like it's becoming a defining characteristic of their current foreign policy approach. It does feel that way. And this pattern of compromise, as you describe it, it hasn't gone unnoticed internally. It's actually ignited significant discontent across various levels of European society. We're seeing sharp criticisms being voiced, with some accusing Europe quite bluntly of surrendering and selling its soul.
Strong words.
Very strong. And this isn't just quiet political grumbling, It's a vocal, public outcry from within the continent itself, reflecting a growing frustration with Europe's perceived lack of agency. This sentiment perhaps reached a peak after what was widely described as a humiliating trip to the White House, where Europe once again seemed to compromise on critical trade issues with the U.S. president. The Financial Times over in the UK, for instance, captured the mood pretty precisely, noting that Europe has been driven to the brink. That phrase really encapsulates the extreme pressure they seem to be under.
Driven.
It makes you wonder, though, what motivates such consistent compromise? Is it sheer necessity in a really complex geopolitical landscape? Maybe a strategic calculation where the short-term pain is deemed worth some long-term gain?
Or is it something deeper?
Exactly. Or is there a more complex underlying strategic choice at play for Europe, perhaps a choice rooted in a deep-seated dependency that we need to unpack? For you listening, it's about discerning whether these are tactical retreats or fundamental shifts in power. It's not always easy to tell.
No, it's not. And that position, that dynamic, became even starker, maybe less ambiguous, with the reemergence of an America First doctrine. Consider a specific moment, a real bombshell moment, back on August 25th.
Okay.
A U.S. president publicly tore apart the existing aid framework for Ukraine. He stated unequivocally, right there at a White House press conference, that the United States would no longer fund Ukraine. This effectively nullified a previous commitment of a massive $350 billion.
Wow.
The U.S. president declared that regarding Ukraine's security, the United States would now only play a, quote, supporting role.
A supporting role?
Yeah, with the primary responsibility falling on European countries. This was a significant redefinition of roles, a clear burden-shifting exercise, and it came amidst a rapid succession of diplomatic shocks that, seemed to leave Europe reeling.
And the speed of it all.
That's what's truly striking here, the sheer speed and the nature of these events. In just over 10 days back in August, Europe experienced what many characterized as Trump-style shocks, signaling a profound disruption of, established diplomatic norms.
Like what, specifically?
Well, on August 15th, for example, Ukraine and Europe were conspicuously absent from the U.S.-Russia meeting in Alaska.
Okay, that sends a message.
A very clear message. That move alone immediately signaled a shift in diplomatic priorities and a sidelining of European interests. Then, just 3 days later, on August 18th, a visit by European leaders to the White House was met with a distinctly cold reception, including, reportedly, downgraded protocol. Now, these aren't just Minor slights, are they? In the highly ritualized world of diplomacy, a cold reception and downgraded protocol are potent, intentional signals.
They communicate a lot without saying a word.
Exactly. They communicate a clear message about diminishing status and importance, often more effectively than any public statement. And, to further drive the point home, European leaders were reportedly made to wait for 40 minutes during a call between the U.S. president and a rival leader. These actions actively disrupt usual diplomatic conventions and communicate a very clear message about Europe's, well, perhaps diminishing standing.
Absolutely.
Extremely blunt, that Europe's importance is quite limited, and furthermore, he asserted that these Europeans can't play any practical role in resolving the Russia-Ukraine conflict peacefully.
Ouch! So this meeting, which seemed harmonious on the surface perhaps, actually laid bare Europe's predicament, exposed a deep chasm in expectations and priorities.
I think that's right. The U.S. president not only directly rebuffed Europe's request to secure a ceasefire before negotiations could even begin, but he also bluntly stated that Europe is the first line of defense in the Ukraine crisis. Full stop.
Placing the burden squarely on them.
Entirely. Then there's the critical issue of security guarantees. He was clearly rejecting Ukraine's NATO accession, and with that, any Article 5-like security guarantees for collective defense.
And for our listeners, just a reminder, Article 5 is the cornerstone of NATO. An attack on one is an attack on all. Denying that fundamentally changes the game.
It changes everything. It fundamentally reshaped the security landscape, placing the burden squarely on Europe without that protective shield of collective defense. The most urgent issue for Ukraine and Europe was security, and the U.S. offered a very specific kind of aid. Ukraine could obtain weapons from the United States with a cost covered by Europeans.
Covered by Europeans.
Yes, and this was explicitly described as not a true security guarantee, precisely because it lacked that critical collective defense commitment of Article 5. It left Europe to bear the financial and the security risks largely on its own.
So it's not just a change in financial aid, it's a fundamental reevaluation of the entire security relationship and a definite shift in responsibility. And you know, this isn't entirely new territory, is it? During the U.S. president's first term, the America First policy openly targeted Europe. I remember him even stating that the EU was an old adversary of the United States.
He did say that. Quite provocative at the time.
And back then, Europe, maybe sensing this shift, was advocating for NATO's strategic autonomy and even the establishment of a self-reliant European army. It's almost as if they saw this coming, maybe, but weren't fully prepared for the extent of it.
Perhaps. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, these actions definitively broke a transatlantic defense and security policy that had lasted for decades, setting a new, much more confrontational tone. Economically, as you hinted, it declared what amounted to an ideological war on Europe with an aggressive trade posture we should definitely get into.
Right.
This consistent approach has put Europe in this cycle of panic and forced acceptance, leading to one predicament after another. It underscores a fundamental shift in how the U.S. views its European partners, no longer merely as allies whose needs are paramount, but maybe as potential economic competitors, or at best, junior partners who need to carry their own weight, often on terms dictated by Washington. The economic aspect. You mentioned an ideological war on Europe economically just now. How did this aggressive stance immediately translate into a new, maybe harsher economic reality for the continent? The information we have points to the U.S. launching a trade war with such speed and aggressive attitude that it really caught Europe off guard, leading to an immediate and significant impact on European prosperity. The speed was definitely a shock. But what's truly insightful here, I think, is not just that Europe got a worse trade deal, but how their traditional negotiating playbook, the one built on collective market power, was fundamentally undermined by this America First approach that prioritized bilateral leverage.
Right. A different game entirely.
Exactly. So on August 21st, the United States and the European Union issued a joint statement detailing a new trade agreement. Officially, the European Commission Trade and Economic Security Commissioner claimed this declaration avoided a potentially harmful tariff war that would benefit neither side. Standard diplomatic language, perhaps.
And is reasonable on the surface.
On the surface, yes. However, the perception within Europe was strikingly different. Many European media outlets viewed these remarks as, somewhat self-serving, maybe putting a positive spin on a difficult reality. An unnamed former EU official went further, telling Euronews that it was simply terrible, a complete surrender, citing no reciprocity.
No reciprocity. What were the specifics?
The stark reality was revealed in the terror details. The U.S. imposes a 15% tariff, while the EU imposes 0 tariffs on all imported American industrial goods.
Zero.
Extremely one-sided. It really exposed Europe's lack of leverage in that negotiation.
That's a huge disparity. And it's even more striking when you consider the historical context. The initial tariff between the US and EU was basically zero, maybe 2% at most, on many goods,
That's
right?
very low.
And now it jumped to 15% from the US side. This rate significantly exceeded Europe's expectations and previous norms, and there's that poignant comparison. The UK had successfully negotiated a 10% tariff with the US.
Which the EU had initially mocked.
Exactly. They had initially mocked that deal, believing in their own collective economic strength to secure a far better outcome. Yet, after what sounds like long and arduous negotiations, Europe ended up with a worse deal at 15%. It clearly illustrates how Europe's belief in their economic strength ultimately led to a worse outcome because they were perhaps too slow to adapt to a new, more aggressive U.S. negotiating posture.
hmm And this specific situation naturally caused significant discomfort for numerous European countries, creating widespread political fallout. The political scene across the continent became rife with criticism of these disguised unequal treaties. You heard quotes like French Prime Minister Bayrou calling them dark days for Europe, capturing a real sense of profound disillusionment.
A dark day indeed.
And Hungarian Prime Minister Orbán, with his characteristic bluntness, even stated that the U.S. president had a lion for breakfast, a very vivid metaphor for the dominant, uncompromising stance taken by the U.S. These aren't just diplomatic niceties. They reflect genuine frustration and a deep-seated sense of having been outmaneuvered, a humiliation that speaks directly to Europe's diminished bargaining power on the global economic stage.
Beyond trade, Europe's economic vulnerability is also deeply intertwined with its energy dependency, and we've seen a very clear and very costly shift in alliances there. This past summer, for instance, Europe faced that severe heat wave challenge. Countries like Italy, France, Spain issuing intense heat warnings.
Brutal temperatures.
Temperatures reached a scorching 46 degrees C in western Spain and Portugal, sadly resulting in fatalities. This tragedy highlights a profound underlying vulnerability when you consider that only about 20% of households in Europe have air conditioning installed.
It's surprisingly low, isn't it?
It is, and even lower numbers in the UK at 5% and Germany at 3%. Now, this isn't merely about comfort, it speaks to a deeper infrastructure and cost problem.
Absolutely. And what's crucial here is that beyond cultural tradition, or perhaps habit, the high cost of electricity significantly deters families from installing air conditioning, especially since energy prices have risen sharply since the 2022 conflict began.
Ah, the connection.
Right. This directly connects to Europe's energy pivot. Despite significant efforts to reduce reliance on Russian energy, the EU has ironically increased its dependence on American energy. Now, this isn't a benign swap. This reliance on relatively high energy prices from the United States increases the cost of economic development for European countries.
How so? Which sectors are hit hardest?
Well, think about it. Industries like steel, chemicals, fertilizers, these are typically very energy-intensive sectors. The sheer volume of power consumed directly translates into a major component of their production costs. When these energy costs rise significantly, it fundamentally impacts their competitiveness, their profitability. It forces really difficult decisions.
Like cutting back or moving elsewhere.
Exactly. It's a classic example of shifting one dependency for another, with real and detrimental economic consequences for Europe's industrial base.
And we can't really discuss energy vulnerability without revisiting the Nord Stream incident, can we? On August 26th, the UN Security Council met publicly at Russia's request to discuss the latest developments surrounding the Nord Stream pipeline blast, which happened 3 years back now.
Feels like longer, but yes.
Those explosions on September 26, 2022, in the Baltic Sea near Denmark and Sweden, on both Nord Stream 1 and 2. That was a critical moment. It didn't just disrupt energy ties, it sent shockwaves through the whole geopolitical landscape.
A huge moment. And while Denmark, Sweden, and Germany immediately launched investigations, they denied Russia's involvement. Yet, here we are, 3 years later, the international community still lacks a clear conclusion or the full truth about who was actually responsible.
Still no definitive answers.
None. And this unresolved mystery looms exceptionally large because, let's face it, the Nord Stream pipeline was a key bargaining chip. It affected the conflict in Ukraine and, more broadly, those crucial energy ties between Europe and Russia. Its destruction removed a critical strategic lever, didn't it? It essentially locked Europe into higher-priced energy alternatives, mainly from the U.S. and elsewhere, without full accountability for how that happened.
Right. The lack of a definitive explanation or transparent investigation leaves this significant geopolitical void. It just adds another layer of uncertainty and vulnerability to Europe's energy future, preventing it from truly diversifying its options, maybe.
I think that's fair. And the ripple effects of these escalating energy costs and these geopolitical shifts are already being seen in widespread industrial shutdowns across the continent. Europe's manufacturing advantage, especially Germany's machinery and France's aerospace manufacturing, inherently energy-intensive sectors, has been significantly weakened.
This isn't just about minor adjustments, then.
Oh no, not at all. It's forcing deep production cuts, it's slowing innovation, and alarmingly, we're even seeing the relocation of entire manufacturing facilities outside of Europe.
Whi-
The crisis is particularly acute in the chemical industry. Now, this is a sector that boasts the highest industrial added value and investment in EU manufacturing. It's foundational,
Really important, yeah.
hugely important, and it's now experiencing widespread shutdowns. Consider ExxonMobil's permanent closure of its ethylene facility in Gravenchouang, France, back in April 2024. At the time, it was initially viewed by some as maybe routine cost optimization.
Just business as usual.
That was the initial take. But no one really anticipated that this would mark the beginning of the most extensive wave of shutdowns in European chemical industry history. The scale is staggering. In just 1 year, from the North Sea coast down to the Mediterranean ports, over 40 large installations from 21 multinational groups with an annual production capacity exceeding 15 million tons were essentially added to the death list.
Oh, so.
Well, the chemical sector provides essential inputs for practically everything: pharmaceuticals, automotive parts, construction materials, advanced plastics. When it struggles, the ripple effect is immense. It leads to higher costs for downstream industries, potential supply chain disruptions, and a significant loss of competitive advantage on the global stage. We're talking about fundamental shifts in industrial capacity that are incredibly difficult, maybe impossible to reverse quickly.
These profound micro-level impacts are clearly contributing to a broader economic deterioration, then. And the numbers, the macroeconomic figures, they seem to show Europe falling behind. The EU forecasts Eurozone GDP. That's the total economic output of the 20 countries, using the euro to rise just 0.9% in 2025.
Sluggish is the word.
Very sluggish growth, barely keeping pace. Nationally, the numbers are equally concerning. German manufacturing has declined for 3 straight years. That indicates a deep-seated structural problem in Europe's industrial heartland, doesn't it?
It really does.
France's fiscal deficit has jumped to 6.2% of GDP, signaling significant government borrowing and potential instability down the line. The European Central Bank keeps cutting interest rates, a move typically aimed at stimulating the economy.
Trying to kickstart things.
Exactly. Yet corporate investment has shrunk by 1.8%. That shows a clear lack of business confidence, right?
Absolutely. Businesses aren't investing despite the cheaper money.
And despite all these measures, inflation is still above the 2% target, further eroding purchasing power for ordinary European citizens.
So here's where it gets really interesting, I think, if we connect these individual data points to the bigger picture. Compare the overall GDP of the EU with that of the United States. Go back about 10 years or so.
Okay.
Europe's and the U.S.'s economic output was pretty close, wasn't it? Almost neck and neck in terms of global share. But in recent years, the total GDP of the Eurozone has fallen significantly behind that of the United States.
Significantly behind.
Yes. It suggests a fundamental change in Europe's capacity to compete on equal footing.
Cutting the last dependence on Russian energy. Congratulations.
When a continent's strength is insufficient, especially when that's combined with a clear dependency on the U.S. for security, compromises and concessions become almost unavoidable, don't they?
Seems that way.
Europe finds itself in a position where it feels it must keep the U.S. engaged, keep them cooperating, even if the terms are increasingly unfavorable. It's a powerful incentive to just acquiesce even when the terms aren't great, perpetuating this cycle of dependency.
Cycle of economic and diplomatic squeeze inevitably casts a long shadow over Europe's military capabilities, turning that economic giant potentially into what some have controversially called a military worm.
That phrase again.
Yeah. Our sources reveal that Europe's share in global military power is currently at its lowest point since the Middle Ages. Now, that's a historical claim, but it highlights the perceived decline. Despite urgent pledges to prioritize defense, especially due to the renewed Russian threat, European leaders face immense difficulties in establishing their own military capabilities that could genuinely act as a credible, independent deterrent.
And the scale of the problem, when you look at the numbers, is truly immense. It's almost staggering. A report by the Bugle think tank and Kiel Institute back in February provided some concrete figures.
What did it find?
It estimated that replacing the approximately 100,000 U.S. troops currently stationed in Europe, just replacing them, would require Europe to increase its military personnel by an additional 300,000 beyond its current 1.47 million active duty soldiers.
An extra 300,000 troops.
Yes. And this isn't just about raw numbers. It would require a specific focus on highly capable mechanized and armored units. To put that into perspective, this means adding about 50 European brigades.
50 brigades.
And furthermore, for effective deterrence in a critical area like the Baltic region alone, the report estimated at least 1,400 tanks are needed, 2,000 infantry fighting vehicles, and 700 artillery pieces. Now get this. These figures, astonishingly, exceed the combined combat strength of France, Germany, Italy, and the UK's current armies.
Wow, more than the big four combined just for the Baltics.
But for credible deterrence there. This isn't merely a small gap, it's a chasm. It illustrates the profound and deeply entrenched reliance on U.S. military might. And this inherent weakness, it seems, has been expertly exploited by what we can clearly identify as a dual-pronged U.S. strategic approach, a kind of dual pressure strategy towards the EU.
Dual-pronged? How so?
Well, on one front, the U.S. applies significant pressure in terms of trade, often threatening to increase tariffs or impose other economic penalties, as we saw. Simultaneously, it issues pointed threats regarding security, explicitly stating things like, if you do not take action yourself, the U.S. won't provide security guarantees for Europe and might leave.
So how did Europe arrive at this complex juncture, where its internal divisions and these external pressures seem to converge so problematically? To truly understand its predicament, we really have to trace the historical roots of its dependency on the United States, a relationship that began a long, long time ago.
Back to the beginning, almost.
Pretty much. After World War I, Europe's status declined and the United States gradually grew into a world power. Then, during World War II, the U.S. fought alongside the UK and other European countries to resist fascism. This alliance was further promoted, even solidified, during the Cold War to address that common enemy, the Soviet Union. This shared history of crisis and collaboration undeniably laid the foundation for the deep relationship, but maybe also the dependency we observe today.
Following World War II, with much of Europe absolutely devastated, the U.S. initiated the Marshall Plan. Officially, it was the European Recovery Program. Massive economic aid flowed into Western Europe.
A lifeline, surely.
It was a lifeline, yes. It undeniably promoted Europe's development and helped rebuild the continent. But, and this is crucial, it also caused Europe to become dependent on the United States.
It wasn't purely altruistic, then.
Well, the underlying intent wasn't purely altruistic, no. The plan also aimed to rejuvenate the European market and create additional opportunities for American products, effectively securing a large market for U.S. goods. And it also hoped for Europe to rearm, aligning it strategically against the growing Soviet threat. So it subtly intertwined economic recovery with strategic alignment and a growing reliance on American capital, and increasingly, American political direction.
And then came NATO, the cornerstone of transatlantic security. April 4th, 1949, foreign ministers from 12 countries, US, UK, France included, signed the North Atlantic Treaty. NATO has played a key role in protecting European security. No one disputes that crucial function, particularly during the Cold War.
Absolutely critical during that period.
But our sources also highlight that it has been a tool for the U.S. to control Europe's political and military matters. So from its very inception, the security architecture also contained elements of control, didn't it? Creating a lasting dynamic where European defense strategy became deeply intertwined with and often subservient to U.S. objectives.
That's a fair assessment. Post-Cold War, this long-standing close relationship between the two sides and Europe's reliance on the United States just continued, almost by inertia, even after the direct Soviet threat dissolved. Europe received tangible benefits, certainly, from strong economic and trade ties with the U.S. and genuinely wanted to keep this close bond.
And the security aspect.
Regarding security, Europe has long viewed its security cooperation with the U.S. as mutually beneficial, perhaps comfortably so, with the U.S. leading and taking on the primary responsibilities. However, this dynamic, this unspoken compact, began to fundamentally shift. the U.S. began altering its behavior, quite notably, maybe starting from a foreign president's first term.
What?
Looking deeper, the underlying reason seems to be the relative decline in power of both the U.S. and Europe. The U.S. perhaps feels it can't take on more responsibilities as readily as it once did, and increasingly wants European countries to align with its goals and bear more of the burden rather than simply responding to allies' demands as perhaps they once did.
So a rebalancing based on perceived power shifts.
It signals a fundamental reevaluation of the transatlantic compact, moving maybe from a paternalistic leadership role to one of a more demanding partner.
And this wasn't a sudden break, was it? The superficial harmony between Europe and the U.S. started showing strain quite early on, after the Cold War, as early as the Clinton era. I recall, for example, the EU passed a law that did not recognize U.S. sanctions over the Cuba issue. An early but clear sign of diverging interests and maybe Europe's nascent attempts to assert its own foreign policy.
That's a good example. And those cracks deepened significantly over time. Under George W. Bush, remember, sharp disagreements emerged within NATO and the EU over the Iraq War and Middle East policy, a clear divergence on major strategic interventions.
A very public split, that one.
Very public. Later, during the Obama administration, the U.S. launched its Asia-Pacific rebalance strategy, effectively sidelining the Middle East and Europe in its primary strategic focus. That left Europe feeling, well, somewhat in despair as it felt its importance diminishing on the global stage.
And more recent.
Then, under the current U.S. administration, acts like the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, and the CHIPS and Science Act have arguably actively drained resources from Europe.
Yeah.
Take the IRA, for instance. It offers substantial subsidies and tax credits for green technologies, but primarily produced within the United States.
So it pulls investment away.
It's not benign neglect. It's a direct incentive, actively pulling European companies to relocate their manufacturing and investment across the Atlantic to qualify for these benefits, rather than developing those critical industries at home in Europe. This strategic redirection of capital has a profound weakening impact on Europe's industrial and agricultural base, further reinforcing its economic vulnerability.
And crucially, let's not forget, U.S.-driven wars from Kosovo to the Gulf, Libya, Syria. These have brought the threat of terrorism spread and refugee waves to Europe, essentially harming Europe's interests in a very direct, very tangible way. These conflicts, often initiated or heavily influenced by U.S. foreign policy, created unforeseen and lasting destabilizing effects right on the European continent, diverting resources and attention away from internal development.
Huge downstream consequences for Europe.
Exactly. And of course, the ongoing crisis in Ukraine, while undeniably a European issue at its core, continues to significantly deepen its impact on the European continent, forcing Europe into difficult choices and, somewhat paradoxically, further entrenching its reliance on the U.S. for security support.
It's no wonder then, is it, that former Italian Prime Minister and European Central Bank President Mario Draghi stated that the EU needs fundamental changes to respond to the tough wake-up call from the U.S. This entire historical progression, it shows a gradual erosion of harmony, a widening of strategic differences, and maybe a growing realization within Europe that the relationship is no longer as mutually beneficial, or perhaps as equally weighted as it once seems. It seems many European leaders harbored illusions about the United States, didn't they? Particularly believing that a former U.S. president was just a temporary phenomenon, maybe an anomaly in transatlantic relations.
Hoping things would just snap back to normal.
Exactly. Believing that once he was gone, relations would simply return to the way they were.
And this deeply held belief, this illusion perhaps, significantly shaped their response.
It seems so. It led them to not dare to adopt a strong confrontational stance against him, even when faced with quite aggressive policies. The result, they felt they were left with no choice but to engage with the United States through a series of compromises, which, as we've discussed, has been widely perceived across Europe as a somewhat humiliating outcome.
You can almost visualize this shifting power dynamic, can't you? Compare that iconic G7 summit photo from Quebec, Canada, 7 years ago?
Yeah.
Where Europe was openly confronting the U.S. president. You could feel the tension in their posture.
I remember that photo well.
Now look at recent photos from the Oval Office in the White House. The U.S. president is comfortably seated in the boss's chair, while European leaders appear much more deferential, perhaps even waiting for an audience. This stark visual contrast powerfully illustrates the significant changes in the relationship and Europe's shifting, maybe less powerful position
The body
at the moment.
So if Europe truly wants to escape this awkward situation and overcome this predicament, the consensus from the analysis seems pretty clear. The most important thing is to enhance one's own strength.
Strength across the board.
Yes, this strength must be multifaceted and deeply cultivated. It includes robust economic competitiveness, driving innovation and growth, cutting-edge technological competitiveness, ensuring Europe remains at the forefront of key industries, and crucially, in the field of security, it requires more determination to build genuinely independent capabilities. Not just talk about it, but build it.
And fundamentally.
Fundamentally, it means making a firm decision to break free from dependence on the United States. Now, that's a choice that requires profound political courage and real long-term commitment, not just reacting to the latest crisis. The ultimate decision Europe must now face is clear and urgent. Is it to continue being a marginal player within the framework of America's first diplomacy, or to show greater political courage, promoting authentic strategic autonomy?
Slogans versus action.
Exactly. Our sources suggest that if it does not shift from slogans to tangible implementation, Europe will continue to find itself in a passive predicament, unable to truly shape its own destiny.
And
Europe's choices in the coming years will have far-reaching implications, not just for itself, but for the entire international order.